Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining me at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about something you may have had struggled with in the past when you're trying to share what you believe with your friends and family. So I want to talk about some simple guidelines, 4 simple guidelines for interacting with people online. And I think it'll help you to kind of figure out how to best interact, especially if you're somebody who's kind of stepped up and started to learn how to use the social media that's available to us. I mean, almost everyone now has got a Facebook account of one sort or another. I mean, my mom, who's in her 70s, just this year became very active on her Facebook account. So I think we're seeing that those folks who maybe in the past would have said, "What's Facebook?" Are already using social media of one nature or another. And if you're like me, you've probably discovered that in some of these different social media networks, you've got a rich, robust collection of clubs and groups and other associations in which folks who have similar interests to you are all together interacting back and forth, either with images like in Pinterest or with all kinds of different ways. Instagram is all of people's personal lives are being posted. There's lots of ways to interact online. And so if you're somebody who's a devout or a devoted follower of Christ, and you're somebody who's engaged in what you believe, you probably can't help but spill over some of that. Jesus says that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And if you're interested in your worldview as a Christian, and you're interested in following Christ, and you're interested in the God who saved you because you have been grateful for having been saved, then you're probably talking about it. As a matter of fact, that's one of the first rules I'd like to try to remember, is that I want my social media to be a pretty accurate percentage reflection of the kinds of conversations that I have with people, even when I'm not online. So in other words, I try not to be one person online and then another person if you knew me personally, if you knew me socially. I want to be the same kind of person. So, for example, if you've met me at a party, you would find out pretty quickly that most of what we would be talking about would be issues of the Christian worldview, related to the Christian worldview, issues of one nature or another, philosophically, scientifically, whatever they may be, because that's the stuff that I love to talk about. And so that's what I always find myself in conversation over those issues. Well, or theology, or some form of theology. Well, it turns out that if you look at my social media, either it's whatever platform I'm on, you're going to see that most of that content is about me talking about or making a case for what I believe as a Christian. That's not because I just turned that on for social media. Unfortunately, you'd be stuck with me at a party saying pretty much the same kind of, or if we got off that we finally exhausted those topics, we might be talking about football. But aside from those two things, probably we're going to be talking about nothing else. So let your expression online, whatever your image is on social media, how people perceive you, ought to be very similar to how they perceive you. Otherwise, if they know you personally, and you're nothing like that at all on a personal level, but sure enough, you're always talking about this on social media, I think that kind of divergent kind of life that you'd be living in front of your friends would actually testify against what you believe as a Christian. It would probably take away from your credibility. All right, so let me give you 4 simple rules that I try to follow, sometimes better than other times, related to my use of social media. The first one is I try to be wise about the public nature of my conversations. And what I mean by that is every platform is different. And how much you're able to engage, for example, in a back and forth on Instagram is different than how much you're able to engage back and forth on a platform like Twitter. And of course, you can go much deeper in a platform like Facebook. So I try to be wise and allow each platform the opportunity and to do what it needs to do without twisting or stretching it too far. Here's what I mean. Let's say I've seen so many times people getting back and forth on theological conversations or philosophical conversations on Twitter. Really? How in the world can anybody do that in 140 characters? It's hard enough for me to contextualize my idea in 1,400 characters, let alone 140. And so I think the idea of trying to use a platform like Twitter to make a powerful, rhetorically powerful statement, that's one thing. But it's very different to use Twitter to make to engage in a long conversation, a long back and forth, where nuanced and more detailed ideas need to be expressed. Very, very hard to do. As a matter of fact, if a conversation like this starts on social media, let's say I post an interesting article I found or an interesting blog that somebody wrote. And on the basis of this, somebody then makes a comment. And I can see that this person's really interested in this and is a seeker. And this is not somebody who's just mocking me or wasting my time, but is really somebody who is engaged in the issue. Well, I got to make a decision. Is Facebook really going to allow me the opportunity to go back and forth? It's probably time for me to say, hey, you know what? Let's do this on email. I've even had to the point where I've eventually had to say, let's do this on a phone call, because there's at some point in which expression such as this is best. You maybe not the kind of person who's a good enough typist or a keyboardist, or somebody who's maybe as articulate in your words on writing them down as you are speaking them. Do you really want to get involved in what might be a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 word dialogue with somebody if you've got to type it all? So there are times when the format, you need to be wise about allowing the format to dictate how you interact. So beware of that. And if you start something in Twitter that you feel like, hey, this is actually worth pursuing, take a time to message that person and get off that format and get into an email situation or into a phone call. Why in the world will we stay in that? Now, you may feel like, well, I don't know this person. This is a stranger. Well, that's another consideration, which we'll talk about today as well, in terms of who you decide to talk to, who you decide to engage. And that's the second point I'd like to make, is that number one, I try to let my wisdom guide my evangelism online by being wise about using the platform the way it's supposed to be used and getting it to an email or a phone call when that's in a more appropriate way to go. The second thing I try to do, though, is to allow my theology to kind of help me as I share what I believe online. Now, here's what I mean by that. I'm somebody who believes that God works first, and to remove the enmity that people have toward God before they'll ever be willing to embrace any of the conversation or evidence for God. I do believe that we have a role to play in sharing the evidence for God's existence and the evidence for the reliability of Scripture and the deity of Christ and the resurrection and all of that. But none of this happens until somebody is first called by God. And that calling often is like, if in my case, it was simply that God removed the hostility I had and allowed me to just even consider the case, because I never would have considered the case until God first acted to do that. Now, the reason why that kind of philosophical or theological underpinning is so important for me is that it helps me to realize that there are people out there that I might try to engage, but my efforts will be largely fruitless unless God has first done something to remove their hostility, to call them to the truth I'm about to share with them. And so I now spend time making sure that I have talked enough to each person I'm sharing with, or know that person well enough to know where they really are in this process. You know, even if you rejected it as a theological foundation, you know this is true even when we select jurors. I'm always looking to make sure I have jurors that are receptive to the message we are going to be delivering to them in the opening statement, throughout the length of the trial, and in the closing argument. And the other side's doing the same thing. If you've got somebody, for example, who's got a bias against the prosecution and hates attorneys, hates prosecutors, boy, you sure don't want that guy or that gal on your jury. They're never going to. The hostility they have toward prosecutors would prevent them from hearing the truth. So we spend time talking to jurors, interviewing jurors before we place them on a jury to make sure that they're receptive to what it is we're about to share with them. Well, the same kind of thing, I think, happens when we're trying to decide who and where we should spend our time online and what kinds of conversations. You can tell pretty quickly if someone is hostile to the Christian worldview, if they're just not ready to hear it. They are there maybe to mock you or to try to trip you up publicly. They've got other motives that are not as innocent as you might like to think that are involved in their dialogue with you. They want to make a public fool of you, whatever it may be. But I know that there are people there who I can sense from my interaction with them, because they're receptive and they're seeking and they've got honest questions that need answers, and maybe they still have a few barriers between themselves and the gospel that I can help remove by making a case. Well, then I'm willing to engage time with those folks. And that's really what we're doing, isn't it, when we're doing Christian case-making, apologetics, is that we want eventually to get to the gospel because we know the power of the gospel. But the problem is the person we're talking to may have a barrier that they've either put in front of themselves by themselves, or that the culture has placed there. They've got some barrier, some wall that's been built up between them and the gospel. They can't even hear it or see it because they've got the wall built. And you need to kind of help them to tear down the wall, and that's what I think Christian apologetics can do. The case we make for Christianity can remove those rocks and boulders that are in their path. And that's what we're trying to do. But I try to be, number one, wise about the kind of platform I'm on, so I know if I'm using it properly. And number two, I try to be, I try to allow my own understanding of how God calls people to hear the message to help me select who it is I'm going to share the message with. I know you can tell immediately that if someone still hates God, that's probably not somebody. I'm going to be very kind, maybe put a little stone in their shoe by offering an idea they can mull over for the next few weeks, but I'm not going to get in a back and forth with them. Now, sometimes people will say, well, gosh, Jim, though, aren't you really, though, helping your those who are watching the conversation publicly? Aren't they assisted a little bit by hearing how you handle these the hostility of the other side, every objection that's leveled, and how you are able to kind of navigate the objections? Yeah, of course. But I think we've got to be very careful about how we spend our time. That's the third point, and I'll get to that right after the break.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
How can we reasonably examine the evidence for Christianity?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is understand that is the standard in courtrooms. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a possible doubt. So we have to help jurors to understand the difference between possible and reasonable. There are lots of things that are possible. It's possible we're not even here right now in this room doing this tape. We're just imagining this, and we're going to wake up tomorrow and realize it was all a dream. I mean, you can at least admit it's possible, but it's not reasonable in light of other pieces of evidence we might have in front of us. And that's really the difference. And I have to help people to understand that anyone can toss out a possibility. But it doesn't mean the possibility is reasonably supported by the evidence. And that's what we're asking jurors to do. As a matter of fact, we instruct jurors in California not to speculate in the jury room about possibilities that have not been supported by the evidence. That's called speculation and it's not allowed. It's actually a jury instruction. So the thing I try to do is I'm examining a case for Christianity is if someone said to me, well, isn't Jesus just a recreation of, say, Mithras or some other prior mythology? Well, how well supported is that by the evidence? If it's not well supported by evidence, then it remains in the possible category, but not in the reasonable category. And I think we can then move beyond it. We can move past it because we're only interested in reasonable inferences, not in any possibility. Okay, now let me confess to you in this third principle. This is one area I really struggle with, and that is the proper use of time. And I know that I could interact more with people online, especially as this ministry called Cold Case Christianity has blossomed. I find myself now having to really limit. The great thing about social media is some of these things will allow you to quickly like something or let them know at least you're engaged. You've listened to you've read their comment, you've engaged their idea, and you either agree or disagree with a simple like. That's helpful. But there are lots of times, let's face it, when you know you're dealing with friends or family where you need to engage with more than just a like. You can't just hit a button. This is going to take time, and you know that you're going to have to spend some time doing this. Well, that's where I think you need to be very, very wise. And I'll let the first two principles dictate how much time you spend. That's why I gave you those first two principles first. Number one, understand what is the social media. I'm not going to be able to go 15 interactions back and forth on Twitter. That's not productive, number one, and it doesn't allow me to. I'm going to right away go to a message on Twitter. So if I'm on a social media that has very, very brief opportunities to interact, well, then I'm going to go to a way I can interact back and forth, direct messaging on that. That's a much better way to do it. Number one, believe it or not, you might think, well, gosh, it's only 140 characters. Well, you do that 10 or 15 times back and forth, you'll see it takes up more time than it would to simply directly message somebody. That's number one. Number two, if I can get to an email exchange, I will sometimes do that. Here's why. There's a certain sense of immediacy on social media. If I post, there's an expectation that within the next 24 hours I'm going to get a response. And if you don't respond within the first 24 hours, then what happens is people start to think, well, is he without words? Does he not know how to respond? Is his silence basically an agreement with the other side? So there's a sense of urgency in social media that says, hey, answer my question now. Or if you can't, I guess I win. Really? Well, that's not the case in email. So if you can right away, I publicly will say, hey, let's go to email on this. And then I'll directly message this guy or gal my email address. So it's not a public situation, but they get it, and now they can email me back and forth. Well, it turns out, I think in email, people understand that I may not get to you till the end of the day tomorrow. And maybe it's the end of the day each day that I type back a few words to you. So there's not this, that you've slowed down the urgency. And believe it or not, that actually ends up working better for you. Also, I can do my email sometimes while I'm traveling or I'm waiting for a plane, those kinds of things. It's a little bit easier than this sense that if all my interaction is publicly on social media, then I've got to really do it pretty quickly, or I look like I'm not able to answer the objection, or like I'm not being appropriate, or I'm being lazy about my social media. That isn't the case. So I think that part of what you do is you have to understand your platform well. Then also there are going to be people who you have to just not respond to. That's the hardest part. There are people who are going to mock, and you have to say, "Hey, thanks. I don't think your tone is really. I don't sense that from your tone that you're really willing to hear my answers anyway." But and then let it go. And I've had to actually, if you're a public figure, you're going to find yourself having to block just a few people who are really openly hostile, and they have all they want to use is your social media as their platform. So be wise about that as well. So that's the third issue: is how do you use your time? And by the way, let me just encourage all of us to think about how much time we are spending on social media. This little thing is the curse right here. This thing, the phone. Your phone as a platform for social media, the way we're using it for social, especially small smartphones. Smartphones are you have no idea. I have no idea how much time I'm spending on social media because it's always available. It buzzes in my pocket to remind me someone's trying to get a hold of me on social media. I'm looking at it every 15 seconds when I'm waiting for somebody in the car, or I'm at a restaurant waiting. Every time there's a down minute, I find myself reaching in my pocket to get the phone out. Really? That's a kind of a bad situation to be in, but I think our culture has kind of moved in that. And if I was to add up all the minutes that I find myself spending on social media right now, oh my gosh, I don't think it would be. You know, when you do a budget and you look at how much money you've spent over the last year, and you realize how much you spent on fast food, and you think to yourself, I need to stop doing that. I bet you if you look at a budget and see how many minutes you're spending in your downtime, you'd realize how many minutes you're spending on social media. So at some point, we're going to have to get this in balance. And yeah, it's true that I do think these kinds of platforms, social media platforms, are changing the way we interact. And we probably are losing some of the skills that we used to have as direct communicators, just using language, just using verbal language, because we've exchanged that for 140 characters or in that range or so when we're texting back and forth to each other or when we're posting on social media. So I think a lot of this is going to be a matter of us being very disciplined. And if I told you that each day this phone was programmed to turn off after, just say 20 minutes, you can get 20 minutes to do everything you need to do on social media every day, you would start to be very wise about who you interact with and how much you say to who you interact with. And at some point you say, give me a phone call. And if it's not important enough to say that to, you might wonder, well, why am I even spending this much time on social media to begin with? So a lot of this, I think, would help us to be a better budgeter of our time if we would impose a restraint on how much time we would spend to begin with. 3 things we've talked about so far: wisdom on how you use the social media platform, let your theology help you select who you communicate to, be very, very concerned and wise about your use of time. And here's the last thing, which I think all of us know and we all get it, and we talk about it all the time, but it's so easy to slip in this area, and that is the issue of wise character, godly character, Christ-like character when we're online. And I think there's one little trick that'll help you interact better. Now, we're in a culture that I think this new atheism is true. Sometimes people say, "Oh, this new atheism is so passé. That was 10 years ago." Well, what I mean is, atheism as it's being expressed in our culture today is much more aggressive. There's not a lot of new ideas, not a lot of new objections to Christianity. But now, I guess, the hostile nature in which people object to Christianity isn't even new, and that's probably true. But the point I'm trying to make is, you're in a culture right now which is more likely to be aggressive in its resistance to you than it was for your parents or your grandparents for sure. Those who oppose what you believe as a Christian are far more likely to be very aggressive in the way they oppose you. Now, if that's the case, we got to think about, well, how then should I hold my character when I'm going to probably see more aggressive objection to what I believe than ever before? Well, it is true that people are going to say things that, especially if you're on a public platform or like a group on Facebook where they're not all your friends on that group. There's a lot of strangers on that group. And you might find people who want to debate your ideas on that group who don't even know you personally. That's where you're far more likely to engage somebody who's going to be aggressive with you. And it's really easy to get your, especially when you're in a debate about things like politics or religion, those are pretty easy to get the tempers to rise. And a couple of quick recommendations. Number one, I try not to post back immediately. If I read somebody who's got an aggressive response to something I've written or posted or said something offensive, I try not to respond immediately. I try to wait. If you can wait an hour, if you can wait a couple of hours, you wait to get home from work, wait till the next morning. Now, again, it kind of violates the principles of social media to wait too long, right? But I guarantee you this, if you won't respond immediately, you're far less likely to respond stupidly because you've had a chance to think about it. And as you think about it, you'll find a way. Number one, you'll calm down and realize it'll put it back in its place. This is a one little interaction on a blog post on one platform in social media that hardly anyone even knows is there. Do I really want to destroy my Christian character for this? Probably not. And number two, you give you a chance to kind of think about a wiser response than you would have if you just immediately respond. That's the first thing. Second, remember that, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. We just said it. Okay, that's true. So if you want people to see what's in that glass that you can't see what the liquid is, just nudge the glass. Whatever spills out, that's what was in the glass. So what happens typically is when we get nudged, our true personality, our true character spills out of the glass. I don't want people to see that. I mean, I have a hard enough time recognizing the fact that I don't have good character sometimes. Do I really want people to see the bad character that I know I have? It'll help me to have better character if I realize that when I get nudged, people are going to see who I really am. And we often get nudged online, and it's a matter of us trying to figure out, well, how do we respond without, spilling out this venom that sometimes happens. So it's really about, I think, and taking your time in your response and remembering that out of the heart, the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So there's four simple principles. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to give you one last principle, one last thing to think about as you engage people online.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Jim, how can we know that Christianity is true when there's still so many unanswered questions? I mean, you can't answer every single question that people have, right? Neither can I. And we do Christian apologetics.
I know. So I think people get a little bit nervous when they think, well, gosh, if guys who are doing this all the time are having problems with this, how am I going to do? Well, a lot of it comes down to evidential sufficiency. Every trial is like this, every criminal trial. At what point does a jury think it has enough to make a decision? And I have to remind jurors all the time that you're always going to have unanswered questions in every case. I've never had a case where there wasn't a series of unanswered and even unanswerable questions, because you're never going to have that answer. I don't care how long you look at the case. And we ask jurors to make a decision in spite of those unanswered questions. As a matter of fact, that's why the standard of proof in trials is not beyond a possible doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if it was beyond a possible doubt, we'd never make any decision. And so I think if we make this, can you know for certainty, for example, that your spouse is being faithful to you? Well, of course we just tell you, yeah, I hear that. But really, everyone who's ever been cheated on and found out and was surprised by it thought they had the same kind of certainty. So if you lived in the range of possible doubts, you'd be immobilized by fear, by uncertainty. That's why the standard of reasonable doubt, I think, is good for us even as Christian believers. Recognizing that we have to have enough evidence to infer that this is the most reasonable inference is really sufficient for us. We can't have every question. Do you think you can know the nature of God as a mere, mortal human? I doubt we're ever going to have all those complete, robust answers. But we can still move, we can still act, we can still make a decision for Christ, even though we don't have every possible answer, because guess what? No one has it. Even when I was an atheist, I couldn't tell you how the universe came into being, how life originated in the universe. Do we really have free will? Do we really have consciousness? Where do these kind of unique features that we seem to live and breathe every day, where do these things come from? Well, the best philosophers in science and in atheism cannot offer answers to those questions either. Yet they're comfortable comfortable in their worldview, even though they have unanswered questions. I think as Christians, we need to know that this is the best inference from evidence, and then be comfortable with those few unanswered questions we might still have.
And you believe Christianity sort of closes the doubt?
Oh, it does. It closes the gap from where you stand to the next answered question. Is much shorter, I think, in the Christian worldview than any other worldview. Okay, last thing here before we go for this week. Remember that all of our efforts as communicators, as Christian case makers, as Christ followers are really efforts to translate heavy ideas, important ideas, difficult ideas in such a way that our friends and family members can actually understand them. In other words, we have to take that ball and throw it in a way that others can catch it. So a lot of what we need to do when we're online is simplify, 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 simplify. Find analogies, find metaphors, find ways to communicate these ideas in such a way that our friends can actually catch them. And so our role really is as translators. Remember, in every trial, you've got expert witnesses, you've got prosecutors, you've got detectives, and you've got jurors. And the role of the communicators, the role of those who want to persuade a jury, is to translate what's been said by the expert witnesses so that the jury understands it and is ready to act. So every conversation I have online is really an effort for me to take something that's much more complex and simplify it without, completely ruining the real meaning of it. I want to make sure that I don't simplify it so much that it's lost its meaning. But our first role is to act as translators. We want to make content accessible. You would never try to speak over the head of your 5-year-old son or daughter. You know what level they can get at. And for a lot of people who have never considered the things of God, never considered the evidence for Christ's deity, never considered the evidence for the reliability of Scripture, these are going to be some concepts that you're going to have to take some time to engage them. If I told people before I go to an event that tonight we're going to talk about textual criticism and textual analysis and the early history of the church, most people would say, I'd rather not go to that. That sounds boring. That sounds like stuff I don't even care about. I don't even know how it would even apply to me. Why do I care? On the other hand, if I said, I'm going to teach you how to use cold case detective principles to determine if Christianity is true, I might be interested in that. Well, what am I doing? I'm really going to do a lot of early church history. I'm going to do a lot of textual criticism work. But the point is, I can't throw it that way. Because if I throw it that way, no one's even going to want to stand behind the plate to catch it to begin with. So as you work with your friends online, remember, find a way to personalize this, to put it in proper context, and to simplify it in such a way that you can at least keep the interest of those with whom you're communicating. Hope those simple principles, the 4 I gave you in this 5th one, are helpful as you try to communicate with your friends online this week. And I'll see you right here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.